Well, good morning, Fire Hall and Warehouse, our friends up in Churchill, and to any of you who might be watching online. We are in the middle of Summer's Greatest Hits, where we're picking songs, the oldies, the goodies that many of us would have grown up with, and bringing biblical truth to them. And today we have a guest speaker, and I have the privilege to introduce him to you. His name is Tim Fletcher. Tim was a pastor for over 30 years, and 11 years ago, he started an organization that is life-changing for people. It's called Finding Freedom. And Finding Freedom is generally a support group, a help, a group of teaching that can help people who are struggling with addictions. But you'll hear more from Tim about that in just a little bit. He's married to Kim, and they have 3 adult children, and it is my pleasure to welcome him onto stage. Will you please join me in giving him a warm Riverwood welcome?
Well, thank you, Carolyn, and I want to just say it's an honor for me to be here. I kind of almost feel this is my church because I'm here every Friday night talking to people at Finding Freedom. And what I want you to know about what happens on Friday night is when we moved to Riverwood 3 months ago, people came in for the first time, and the overwhelming response was, wow, what a welcoming, warm place. And so that's to your credit, and we really do appreciate the whole Riverwood Church community and what you have done in welcoming Finding Freedom. If you're not familiar with Finding Freedom, it started really as trying to help addicts, but what I based it on, and it caused the whole ministry to broaden, was that addiction is not really the real issue, it's a symptom of the real issues. And so a lot of people, yes, addictions become a problem, but there was a time in their life when they saw drugs and alcohol as the solution to their problems. And so what we work on and focus on is what are those underlying problems. And over the last 10 years, there's been a ton of research that's really changed the whole way we look at helping people with addictions. And they found out about 97% of people who are addicts grew up in an environment where they didn't feel safe for some reason. It could have been abuse or abandonment or neglect, or it could be just they didn't feel unconditionally loved. And so they were always a little bit anxious about whether they're going to get hurt on any given day, so they lived in this fight-flight mode. And that is what set them up for drugs and alcohol, which is the perfect way to fight or flight or just numb everything out. And so what we work at Finding Freedom is that stuff. And so I would suspect that most of you here who aren't addicts have some of that stuff. And so I would love to see you come and check Finding Freedom out. And what you'll find is you fit right in, and you might be close to being screwed up as all the addicts that come out. But I think you'll find it a beautiful thing to see people's lives changing. Because what we really focus on is not so much the addiction, but what does a healthy person look like? What was God's design for us in all areas of life, relationship, coping, all of that? So I hope you'll come and check it out. One of the things that I have dealt with as I deal with people from very troubled childhoods is they grew up and they may have heard from somebody that God would be there for them, which is why I picked that song today. And they would go into their lives as a kid and they would get sexually abused, physically abused, and they'd pray, God, please stop. Please stop Daddy. Please stop my abuser. Please stop the bully. And they'd pray, and nothing changed. And to them it was, well, I guess God's not there for me. And so to their mind, why would God not be there for me? And their conclusion was maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I've messed up too much. Maybe God only is there for people who have their act together, people who've lived well, people who are making lots of good decisions and serving in lots of good ways, but I don't seem to fit, and I don't think God would love me or even want to use me. And then they might come into a church and hear about God's love, and they could understand academically that God does love everybody. For God so loved the world, Jesus loves me, this I know. They would hear all of that, but in their heart, they would still have doubts. And maybe there's many of you here this morning that understand those doubts. And part of what goes on in your thinking is, okay, I accept God loves me, but I think maybe His love is, well, I'm a bit of a burden to Him. He loves me out of obligation, but He kind of rolls His eyes every time I come around. Wonder what my problem is today. And He loves others more than me, more passionately than me. And I just get a little bit of God's love, and He's not that excited about me. And if you're here with that thinking this morning, I want to address that. And I want to take 4 events that happen at the very beginning of Jesus' public ministry as a preacher, as a leader, as a healer in ancient Israel. And I want you to begin to understand what those events were really saying. One of the challenges for me as a preacher, as a Bible student, is that the Bible was written 2,000 years ago. It was written in a culture that was very different from our culture, a culture that looked at life and had rituals and traditions that were very different from the ones that we have. And so for us to understand this 2,000-year-old book, we're not going to really get all the gems out of it unless we understand the culture, unless we understand the history and what was going on at the time. Then the Bible starts to become alive. And the 4 events I'm going to share with you this morning, if you were just to read them from the 21st century, you would go boring, because that's how they would appear. But for a person living in the 1st century, if they were to read the 4 events that I'm going to talk about, they go, wow. And so if I do my job to write this morning, I hope at the end you're going, wow, as well. So what I want to begin with is when Jesus picked His 12 disciples. And so His plan was to pick 12 men that He was going to spend 3 years with. And after He went back to heaven, He was going to send them into the world to carry on His ministry. So let me read you the event, and you'll find out it's not that interesting from our perspective. One day, as Jesus was walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, He saw 2 brothers, Simon, also called Peter, and Andrew, throwing a net into the water, for they fished for a living. Jesus called out to them, "Come, follow me, and I will show you how to fish for people." And they left their nets at once and followed Him. To a 21st century person, that just sounds like Jesus is saying, "Come, be my disciples," and we kind of leave it at that. To a Jew reading that, they would be, wow. And let me explain why. In that culture, every boy, girl went to school, but the boys especially, they had to memorize the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis to Deuteronomy. And if you ever read them, they are full of begats, and they're full of this person died and begat this person, and there's all kinds of boring stuff, but they had to memorize all of that. And the real keen students, they memorized the entire Old Testament of our Bible. And when they graduated, the following would take place. The top rabbis, or the top religious teachers in Israel, would go and tour the top schools. And what they were looking for was the smartest, brightest, most talented boy who was about to graduate. And they would interview the teachers, they would interview people in the community, and after they had decided, they'd found out who was the brightest, most capable kid, they would approach him and they said, "Follow me." And what they were saying was, "I want you to leave your mom and dad, to leave any other opportunities, and give your life, devote your life to being mentored by me. You'll spend every day with me. And the goal of my time with you over the next years is that you will begin to know everything I know. But more than that, I don't want you just to have head knowledge. I want you to become like me in character. So that when you have finished your mentoring process, I can send you out as a fully qualified representative of me. So that happened. After they picked the top boys, there are still a lot of boys left. So they went to option number 2. All the boys that were left were told that they could approach any other rabbis in Israel and ask them if they would mentor them. And so all these boys would go off to find the rabbis of their town and neighboring towns, and they would say, "Please, could I follow you?" And the rabbi would then check them out, talk to their teacher, their family, the community, and then they would decide which ones they would allow to follow them, and they would go back to them and say, "Follow me." Still, there's all kinds of boys left. The ones that weren't chosen. And so their option, which was the only other option, was to return home and work with Dad in the family business. They were the ones that were the losers, the rejects. None of the rabbis wanted them. And so, did you notice where Jesus picked his first 4 disciples? They were fishing in Dad's boat. They had been overlooked, rejected. They were considered losers. And they had gone back to work in the family business for Dad. Can you imagine if you were in the HR department for Jesus, starting out his own business and ministry, and he says, "I'm going to begin by picking 4 losers. Ones nobody else wanted, they're on the reject pile, that's where I'm going to start." And you would go, "Oh, I don't know what you've been smoking, but that's not a good plan." And Jesus says, "I'm not done yet." He then went and picked this guy called Matthew. And Matthew was a tax collector. And to us, tax collector is just another job in our culture, but you need to understand it in the Jewish culture. So at the time of Jesus, Israel was ruled by the Roman Empire, which basically ruled most of the world. And so what Rome wanted was every country that they had conquered, they wanted them to give them money or tax money every year. But they didn't want to go and collect the taxes themselves from all those individual countries because they were already the bad guys. And they didn't want to create more unrest and hatred of Rome. So here's what they did. They went looking for the most corrupt, dishonest Jewish men they could find. And they would say to them, "We have a business opportunity for you. We would like you to collect taxes from your own people. And so we'll give you a dollar amount. Let's say we want you to collect $1 million from this area of Israel. But here's the bonus. You collect that 1 million and give it to us, but anything you collect above 1 million, you keep for yourself. And the other bonus is you can decide what you tax them for. So you can create new tax laws every day." And so if there was the 4 young men, the fishermen, they would catch their catch in the Sea of Galilee. Then they'd have a cart to carry it off to market. Matthew would be able to come along and say to them, "I'm going to charge you for each wheel on your cart. You got 2 wheels, you now have to pay me this much." And then if the next day they came with a 4-wheel cart, Matthew would stop them and charge them even more. And then the next day could make up a brand new tax law. Can you imagine how tax collectors were viewed by the Jewish people? They were considered traitors because they were working for the enemy and they were ripping off their own people, They were stealing and getting rich off their own people. They were dishonest, corrupt. And so what happened in Israel is they made a law that if you're a tax collector, you can never testify in a court of law. Because we do not believe you are honest, we believe you are dishonest and corrupt, and so your testimony would be totally unreliable. So you're not allowed in a court of law. Secondly, you're not allowed in church. We don't want scum like you, the enemy, in our church. So they were banned from church. And then they actually taught this. They taught God loved everybody in the world except tax collectors. And they took it a step further. God was happy when tax collectors died. So you imagine Jesus is going to Matthew and says, "Follow me." And then everybody's going, "What? God's happy when tax collectors die. God doesn't love tax collectors." And Jesus says, "Oh, yes, he does. You've missed the heart of God." But imagine Jesus bringing Matthew back, and there's Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and they look at Matthew and they say, "That's the guy that's ripping us off." And Jesus says, "Let's have a big group hug here." And they're going, "Not a chance." And then there's another guy that Jesus picked called Simon the Zealot. And what's interesting about that word zealot is it tells us that Simon was part of a gang. And that gang was well known. It was made up of very zealous men that hated Rome and that hated tax collectors. And what they were known for, they were called dagger men. They carried a dagger. And so in that culture, men wore flowing robes and cloaks. And they would hide their dagger underneath their robes. And as they were walking through a marketplace, if they came up beside a Roman soldier or a tax collector, they'd pull their dagger out and stab them and keep on walking. And the person would drop over dead. That's who Jesus picked. Imagine a group hug now with Matthew and Simon in the same group. Jesus is picking a murderer, a gang member. What is wrong with you, Jesus? So back to HR. Okay, Jesus, you say that's your plan A. Surely you got a plan B. Jesus says, "No, I don't." He says, "You're going to reach the whole world through 12 losers. 12 men that were corrupt, murderers, gang members, rejected. You want them." And Jesus says, "Wait and watch what happens. I'm going to pour my life into them for 3 years. I'm going to teach them everything I know. I am going to let them see a healthy person up close. And after 3 years, I'm going to set them loose on the world." And to the average person, they go, "Wow, that is a recipe for failure. You got to come up with a plan B." Jesus said, "Wait and see." And those 12 losers changed the world. Now here's what I want you to understand. As you read through the Bible, what you find is that when God picked people for important tasks, He always picked losers. He always picked people who were quite broken and messed up. You look at the life of Moses and Abraham and David, all of them, very messed up. And you go, why did God do that? Paul says in 1 Corinthians that God has placed His treasure in an earthen pot. So in that culture, your only storage container was an earthen or clay pot. And I've seen hundreds and hundreds of these clay pots, and they put a lid on. And what Paul is saying is God put His treasure in us. Because in Genesis, God made Adam out of clay. And so we're clay pots. But there's another part you have to add to this. In that culture, when you went to go somewhere at night, you would make a torch. And so you'd have fire at the end of a pole, but if it was a windy night, your torch would blow out. And so what they do is take a clay pot and put it over their torch. Now, that's a problem if you got a great clay pot, because then you can't see it because it's blocked all the light. So what kind of clay pot did you look for? A cracked pot. One with holes in it. So guess who God likes to choose? Cracked pots. That's us. Why? Because when people see the light of God shining out of us, they go, that's obviously not their light. That's His light. And God gets the credit. And so you won't see any of those 12 disciples traveling through the world going, I'm going to hold an autograph for him and I'm going to tell you how great I am. No, they're going around saying, wow, God is using me and His light is shining out of me and changing lives. I am so thankful I was cracked enough that God could use me. A beautiful little picture. Now I want to take you to the second example, the second event, and that is the baptism of Jesus that happened at the very beginning of His ministry. And to understand it, you got to understand two very important rituals that existed in the Jewish world and the Roman world. So in the Jewish world, and you might be very familiar with this, was a bar mitzvah. And a bar mitzvah was a special celebration for a young Jewish boy, usually at the age of 12 or 13, where he was now going to be presented to the rest of the world as an adult. He was no longer considered a child. He was now considered a son of the law and a responsible adult. So they would have this great big celebration. And I've had the privilege of being at one. And then at the end, the dad would bring the son up and he would say, this is my son. I am very proud of him. And it was a presentation. In the Roman world, they had that almost same ritual. They just gave it a different name. They called it an adoption ceremony. Now, we think of adoption of taking a child that isn't biologically ours and making them our own. And that's a possibility, but that's not what the Roman adoption ceremony meant. It was the same thing. When a young man grew to become an adult, Dad would hold a great big celebration before the whole town, everybody invited, and then he would present his son now as a mature adult and say, this is my son, I am very proud of him. Now let me take you back to the Jewish world. There is one time in the Jewish world where a boy would not get a bar mitzvah, and that was if he was considered an illegitimate child. If he was considered a bastard child. What is really interesting is that that's what Jesus was considered. In John chapter 8, Jesus is in an argument with the religious leaders of Israel, and they're discussing who their father is. And Jesus is claiming God is his father. The Jews are claiming Abraham and God is their father. Jesus saying, no, you're the father of the devil. And they get all angry and they go, we know who our father is. At least we're not like you, an illegitimate child. And they say that to his face. And that rumor was based on Mary being a virgin, and now all of a sudden she's pregnant. She's not married, and nobody was buying the Virgin Mary story back then. So in their mind, they were spreading throughout the communities that Mary was pregnant either by having an affair or she was raped by a Roman soldier. Now what that meant was that when Jesus was growing up, he wasn't allowed a bar mitzvah because he was considered an illegitimate child. So let me read you his baptism in Matthew 3. It says this, then Jesus went from Galilee to the Jordan River to be baptized by John. After his baptism, as Jesus came up out of the water, the heavens were opened. And he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and settling on him. And then a voice from heaven said, this is my deeply loved Son, who brings me great joy. Jesus just had his bar mitzvah. Because God was saying, you people said he's illegitimate. He's not. He's my son. You didn't allow him to have a bar mitzvah at 12 and 13. I'm having it now when he's 30, and I'm doing it big time. Now let me tell you why I tell you that. In Ephesians 1, it says that we were adopted into God's family. And again, some of our minds go that God adopted us into his family, and it's because somebody twisted his arm, and he just did it out of obligation. But he's not that excited about us. He just puts up with us and tolerates us. But we're a bit of a burden and a bit of a downer in his life. Now, here's what it says in Ephesians 1. God decided to adopt us into his family by bringing us to himself through Jesus Christ. This is what he wanted to do, and it gave him great pleasure. You know what he did the day you came into God's family? He said, this is my kid, and I am excited to have him in my family. And then in Romans, it also talks about this adoption. So you have not received a spirit that makes you fearful slaves. Instead, you received God's Spirit when he adopted you as his own children. And what Paul is saying there is that you used to have a father, and he made you fearful, and he made you a slave. You had a father that caused you to always be afraid of getting hurt, of having bad things happen to you. And you became a slave to all kinds of dark stuff in your own dark side. But when you came into God's family and he adopted you, you had a loving father who takes the fear away. A father who will be there for you. And he is excited to have you in his family. So God, believe it or not, gave us a bar mitzvah or an adoption ceremony where he announced that he was proud that we were his kids. Now there's a third thing that happens. Matthew, when he begins talking about the life of Jesus, realizes that the common mindset of his culture when a religious leader came on the scene was that the religious leader would go after the very prestigious people in the community. People with great position, power, lots of money, people that were respected in the community, and that's where they devoted their time and their attention. And so the mindset would be, that's probably what Jesus is going to do when he comes on the scene. He's just going to give his attention to the people that have it all together, to the people who have succeeded and are prestigious and are well respected. So Matthew says this, no, that's not what Jesus is like. Let me tell you about the heart of Jesus. Let me tell you about the heart of his ministry. And he takes a prophecy from the book of Isaiah, and he says, this is Jesus. Look at my servant, whom I have chosen. He's my beloved. He who pleases me. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not fight or shout or raise his voice in public. He will not crush the weakest reed or put out a flickering candle. Now that bruised reed and a flickering wick doesn't mean anything to us. But to people living in that culture, that meant volumes to them. So let me explain it. In that culture, reeds were everywhere, just like Manitoba. There's reeds in every ditch. In that culture, flax was everywhere, just like Manitoba. It was so plenteous you couldn't sell reeds, you couldn't sell flax straw, because it was just everywhere. So here's the context. If you were a little shepherd boy, and there were lots of little shepherd boys, and Dad sent you out to look after the sheep, it would be very boring, because sheep are rather boring to sit and watch, eat, and sleep. And so what a shepherd boy would do is he'd cut a reed out of a ditch, and he would carve holes in it and make a flute. And then he would play his flute as he watched his dad's sheep. But if you can imagine, as you play a flute, saliva is coming out as you blow, And so eventually, the saliva would cause the flute to break down. And it no longer made the right sound. And it became what they called a bruised reed. So what does the boy do? Well, there's lots of reeds around. There's no point trying to fix this one up. Let's just throw it away, and I'll cut another reed, and I'll make another flute. And that's what he did. And then with flax, your house was lit with a little lamp that had oil, and then a little piece of flax straw was your wick. And you would light the flax straw, and that would give you a certain amount of light, but it would burn down. And when it started to flicker, it was just about done. So what would you do? Would you take it out and work on it? No, there's flax everywhere. You throw it away and get a new piece of flax straw. Here's what Matthew is saying Jesus' ministry is about. There's lots of people in the world who are broken. What do you do with these very broken, messed up people that have failed, that their life has fallen apart, that are bruised reeds and flickering wicks? Well, Lot would say just throw them out. There's over 7 billion people. There's lots more to take their place. Is that what Jesus does? No, it says he takes a bruised reed and he doesn't crush it. He restores it to make music again. He takes a flickering wick and he doesn't crush it. He restores it to make a fire again. And what does Matthew want us to see? If you want to understand the heart of Jesus, he's not about people that have their act together. He's about people that everybody else has done with. He's about people that others say they're too broken to repair. Just get rid of them. And Jesus says, that's the people I take. And I restore them so they can make music again and shine a light again, because I'm into broken people. There's one other event. After Jesus started his ministry, the first sermon he ever preached was what we call the Sermon on the Mount. He went up a hill, sat down, hundreds and hundreds of people came to hear this new rabbi preach a sermon. After he was finished, and it's in Matthew 5-7, the next verse in Matthew 8 says, Jesus, coming down the hill, is confronted by a man with leprosy who says, I know you can heal me, please heal me. And Jesus heals him. That would have blown people's minds, because Jesus doesn't just heal him, he does one other thing. But before I tell you that, let me tell you about leprosy. In the Jewish culture, leprosy was the most feared, hated disease, because it was the only disease that they had no cure for. It was a disease that was considered contagious. And for a person who contracted leprosy, it was a miserable, terrible life. It deadened your nerves so that you could be working all day, rubbing your finger against something and never feel it. And then your finger would fall off. Then their nose would fall off. Their toes would fall off. And they quickly became disfigured people. And the Jews had this massive fear of leprosy. So if a person was diagnosed as having leprosy, law required that they leave their family, their village, and go into the desert, far away from people. And most would live in a cave. And then every once in a while, they would sneak out at night and come to the edge of the village, hoping somebody had left them some scraps of food to eat. Now picture, and we don't know about this leper that Jesus healed, but picture a man that has a family, a husband and a father. He loves his family, but one day he has to leave them as they cry as he goes away, and he lives in a cave. I can imagine on many, many nights, he cried himself to sleep, wishing he could hug and hold his children, wishing he could hug and hold his wife, but he couldn't. And so, in a cave, he lived as an outcast. He lived with depression. He lived with tremendous pain and longing in his heart. But he hears about Jesus. And he decides he's going to take a great risk. He's going to go into the village, which was against the law. He'll get spit at and yelled at, and stones will be thrown at him as he makes his way to where Jesus is at. But he hears that Jesus can heal. And so he takes that risk. And he goes up to Jesus and he says, Jesus, heal me. Now here's what Matthew wants us to see. Jesus could have kept his hands away and said, be healed. And the man would have been healed. But Matthew says Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. And everybody would have said, what are you doing, Jesus? You don't touch a leper. And you want to know Jesus' response? I could heal his physical stuff from a distance. But this man is a broken soul. This man is a broken man emotionally. This man is a broken spirit. And I can't heal that from a distance because he needs a hug. And I am going to touch this man so that he knows he is loved. Doesn't that make Jesus a beautiful person who loves you regardless of what you're feeling today? If you're feeling very broken and messed up, that's the kind of love he has for you. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, thank you so much that you loved us to the greatest extent of love that was ever possible. We don't deserve it, but you gave it so freely. And for those that are struggling this morning, that you would just cause them to sense and feel in a new way how deeply you love them. Amen. Carolyn will come.
All right, will you please thank Tim for his message? Thank you, Tim, for being here, and also Kim and Brittany, his wife and daughter are here with us as well. And we're just been so blessed all weekend long by your ministry, and so thank you so much. For all of you, as you are leaving, I just want to wish you God's grace and peace as you walk out these doors. And I hope that this week ahead is really good for you. And we look forward to continuing our series next week.